How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another YouTube video. In this video, I'm going to go over how to overclock your Intel 13th, 14th, or 12th gen processor to get more FPS, lower input delay, and just a better game feel overall. The first two steps that you want to make sure to get are downloading the Benchmate program and downloading HW info before continuing this video. And now just a quick disclaimer, if you have a bad CPU cooler, if you have a bad power supply, or if you have bad cooling in general in your PC case, then I recommend to not follow this video at all. Pretty much click off this video. The other thing is, if you have a B series motherboard, so a B760, B660, any motherboard that begins with the letter B, you cannot overclock your processor as these are locked motherboards from Intel and you bought a locked one. Now, if you have a Z series motherboard, you can overclock your CPU as long as the CPU is unlocked. Now, some of you can have Z series motherboards with processors that are locked. So for example, to identify if your processor is locked, open up your task manager, go to performance and click CPU. If your CPU ends in the letter K, KF, or KS, you pretty much overclock your processor with no issues as long as you have a Z series motherboard like a Z790, Z490, or a Z690. Now, if you have a CPU that ends in the letter F, or you have a CPU that doesn't end in a letter at all, that means you have a locked processor. You cannot overclock it and you cannot really do anything with it. You can only overclock your RAM, which is a completely different topic and completely complex topic that we're not going to go over in this video. However, we do offer RAM overclocking services in our Discord, and we do RAM overclocking services in the Ultimate PC Optimizations. For the purposes of this video, make sure you have a processor that is unlocked and make sure you have a Z series motherboard. Other than that, you're pretty much good to go. Now, we're going to download HW info, and we're going to download Benchmate on this OS, and we're pretty much going to get a baseline run our current system and see what the score is that we get in an Alta Cinebench R15 Extreme, which is going to be the test that we're going to be using. So for the purpose of this video, make sure you run HW info in sensors only, just like how I did a second ago. And then you can just press do not monitor, and then we're just going to look at our core clocks, temperatures. These are the three most important metrics that we're going to look at in this video. vCore needs to not surpass a certain threshold, and temperatures should not go too high. Now, a lot of you are going to notice that your core is going to start thermal throttling very, very easily, and that's just because your cooling is not up to par, or your vCore down here is just a little bit too high. So we're going to go over that in the BIOS in a second. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to go cover everything in ASUS brand BIOS. So every other BIOS is going to be completely different. However, the settings kind of transfer over if you use some common sense. If you are very inexperienced with PCs and you don't have an ASUS motherboard, then I do not recommend following this guide because CPU overclocking is kind of complex. If you want this done for you, just go to the first link in the description and we got you. So to launch pretty much with Benchmate, all you want to do is just press the install button and just give it a second because this has a whole bunch of benchmarks in it along with some necessary tools to look at your system information and your sensors and stuff like that. Let's wait for this thing to pretty much download, and we're gonna pretty much get a baseline run our current system with zero overclocks other than turn on XMP. So as you guys can see, it's gonna open up exactly like this. All we're gonna worry about is Cinebench R15 Extreme, and make sure you have hardware info open up right now. Press accept on this, and I don't recommend using the hardware info from Benchmate because it tends to lag out and not show you the current sensors. So make sure that you install hardware info separately and then open it just like so. What we're going to do is, as you guys can see, we're going to look at vCore and we're going to look at core temperature. So as you guys can see, we easily hit 90 degrees, which is completely normal on this test because this test is very, very intensive, and usually 3 runs of this test make sure that you're completely stable and you're able to play games with no crashes and performance loss with overclocking. So as you see, I spike up to around 98 degrees, but I don't thermal throttle, which is a key component. Now, it did just say thermal throttling at the end, but for most of the time, I did not thermal throttle. That's what you want to make sure. Now, if you thermal throttle almost instantly, that means your CPU cooler is not set to the highest fan speeds or pump speed, or for example, you don't have a contact frame, which looks like this. The contact frame pretty much lowers your temperature by up to 15 degrees. So it's a very big difference getting a contact frame versus not. So if you don't have a contact frame and you want to get good overclocks, you want to make sure you buy this and then install it into your computer and then go with the overclocking. However, you can still overclock without a contact frame. You're just going to get lower results. So as you guys can see, if you look at vCore, it's going to drop all the way down to 471 apparently. I think the average is what we're going to look at, which is so we dropped to around 1.27 this test, which is completely normal. But what we're going to do now is take note of this result, which is 1705, and now we're going to go to BIOS. So I'm going to restart my computer and spam delete. All right, so we're in the BIOS. It might look completely different for you guys if you're not on ASUS. However, if you're on ASUS, just follow what I do. So go to Extreme Tweaker or AI Tweak, and then we're going to set Intel Adaptive Boost Technology to disabled, and then ASUS Multi-Core Enhancement enabled to remove all limits. And if your cooler is really, really bad, I recommend just setting it to remove all limits 90 degrees. What this is going to do is at 90 degrees, it's going to start pretty much lowering down the CPU speed. So you're not hitting anything above 90 degrees. It's pretty much a power limit. Since I have a decent cooler, I'm going to leave it enabled to remove all limits. I'm going to scroll down. Performance core ratio, sync all cores, and all core ratio limit, you're going to set it to the 4 13th gen processors like 13900K or 13900KF. You're going to start at 50. If you're on a 13900KS, you're going to 56. If you're on a 14900KF or 14900K, you're going to set this to 56 as well. If you're on a 14900KS, you set that to 57 and work your way up. For my CPU, I'm going to start at 56, just like so. And efficient core ratio, sync all cores as well. I'm going to set this to a 3. If you have a 13th gen processor, it's also going to be 43. If you have a 14th gen, it's going to be 44. You just want to make sure that you're setting it to slightly higher than the stock speeds. So if you looked at your CPU core temperature, if you look at your CPU core clocks, whenever running that baseline test, you would see what it's currently running at. So for me, it was 5.6 gigahertz on the P cores, which is what I have set right here, 4.3 gigahertz on the E. Now the ring dropped down to 4.5 gigahertz, which is the kind of the stock ring for all these CPUs. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to find CPU cache ratio right here. Ring down bin, disable that. And then we're going to set this to 48. And usually this should work on most processors. Now, the easiest way to identify if your ring is unstable is it's going to pretty much blue screen your PC if it's unstable running that. Now, once that does that, just drop the ring down by 2 and it should pretty much be fine. Or drop it by 1 and see if you're fine there. Now, BCLK aware adaptive voltage and ring down bin, make sure to disable these because they do mess up with overclocking. Now, if you just play games and you don't really care about multi-threaded performance playing games and you don't need to render stuff, you don't need to do anything crazy with extra threads and extra core counts, you could go to advanced, you could go to CPU configuration and you could disable some hyper-threading. This is going to lower input delay and this is also going to pretty much make your overclocks, because this is going to reduce your heat, it's going to reduce your voltage requirements, and you're just going to get better performance in gaming. Now, however, for stuff like rendering, encoding, stuff like that uses the processor and extra threads, this is actually going to mess up the performance in that area. Since we're just making this video to overclock our CPU for games, we're just going to disable it. If you play games like Fortnite, Valorant, or any of these competitive games that do not really scale with cores, then you can pretty much set active efficient cores to 0 and just overclock your P cores, and then you get insane overclock just like that. Now, if you play Call of Duty, then I recommend leaving this to all actually, because Call of Duty does in fact get more performance if you leave the E cores on. Now, depending on your game, it might like E cores off or E cores on, and then that's it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do this exact same thing. I'm gonna set this to 0. I'm gonna go to Extreme Tweaker. Actual VRM core voltage, I'm gonna set this to manual mode, and then CPU core voltage override, I'm gonna set this to 1.3 just like so. And then I'm gonna scroll up, I'm gonna go to DG plus VRM. For your motherboard, it might be completely different. If you're on ASUS, it's always gonna be DG plus VRM. For you, it might be digital all power or advanced voltage settings or advanced VRM settings. It really depends on the motherboard. So I'm just gonna go to DG plus VRM. I'm gonna check what my CPU load line calibration is. So as you guys can see on auto, it's set to level 3, and auto is gonna be completely different for every single motherboard. It might be level 4, it might be mode 6. Auto is always gonna be different. So for the purposes of this video, I'm gonna set this to level 7 on ASUS. Now, if you're on a lower end ASUS motherboard, this is gonna be completely backwards. So mode 4 is gonna be pretty much mode level 6 on ASUS if you're on a lower end ASUS motherboard, but I'm not going to dive into that. Basically, if you have CPU low line calibration just like this, and the bottom of the description says level 1 equals greater VDROOP and level 8 equals minimum VDROOP, you're just going to set this to level 7. Now, if it's the opposite and it says level 1 equals minimum VDROOP, level 7 is greater VDROOP, then you're going to set this to level 4. And that's for the lower end ASUS motherboards that are not the greatest for overclocking. They just have the setting completely backward. If you have that motherboard, that's level 4. If you're on this crazy motherboard like this, which was the Extreme BIOS and the Extreme Tweaker, you're gonna set this to level 7. Just make sure the description is the same as mine. If you set to level 7, if it's not the same, then low line calibration is completely different and you're not going to be able to follow this video properly. Then you're going to go back, and then what you're going to do is going to set this to around 1.3 if you're going to use level 7. If you're going to use level 4 on the lower end Asus motherboards, I recommend starting off with 1.28. But either way, you want to make sure that you're on a voltage that is not too high. For VCore, whenever you load that test up that we ran earlier, VCore should not exceed 1.28. If it does, you're going to pretty much damage the CPU potentially, and it's just going to be way too much heat for your CPU. You would not be able to cool that down with that CPU. Pretty much you need a crazy CPU cooler. I'm going to set to 1.28 for this video. Just like that, we're going to start off with that at level 7 at 56 and the cache ratio at 48. So now I'm going to exit, and because we disabled the efficient cores and hyperthreading, our score is going to be a lot lower because this is just a multi-threaded performance based score. So the less the cores, the less the threads, you're going to get lower performance. But the goal of this, if you're just playing games, is just to get something stable. And if you're increasing it, you should see a boost in the score slightly just because you're increasing the frequencies and the ring rate. So I'm going to load up this PC and let's see what happens. All right, so we got the OS loaded up. All we're going to do is we're going to open up HW info, make sure sensors only is checked. Now, as you guys can see, we're at 5.6 gigahertz on only the P cores because we disabled the E cores, and our ring clock is at 4.8 gigahertz. And if you scroll down here, you can see that our V cores are around 1.27, aka 1. So you just want to double check all of those, and you want to make sure your temperatures obviously just didn't skyrocket for whatever reason. If they did, there's something wrong. You either set the voltage way too high or your CPU cooler is not set to full. You want to double check. CPU temperatures are very, very high after just exiting and saving BIOS. That means your VCore is extraordinary high. So I'm going to make sure that's fixed. Now, all we're going to do, open up Benchmate just like so, and we're going to extreme. Let's run on this and look at HW. So as you can see, we dropped to around 1.25 voltage, which is really, really good. That's a really low voltage, and we're not going to have problems with overheating. Now, if the voltage is too low, sometimes you're going to get a crash with the Cinebench program, or your whole PC is going to crash, or you're going to get a blue screen. In that case, that means your voltage is too low, so try upping it a little bit. Again, I'd recommend not going above 1.28 test running. So if your VCore says above 1.28 whenever you're running this test, so it goes up to 1, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Turn down the voltage a little bit and maybe turn down the speed. I'm gonna run this for around 2 more times, and I'm gonna make sure that we don't get any crashes or any blues. All right, so that's the first one done. As you guys can see, it did not thermal throttle at all during that. If you thermal throttle, the test is not going to properly test CPU because you're thermal throttling and the core pretty much just lowering themselves down because of the heat. And that's usually just because your CPU cooler is absolutely trash, and especially at this low voltage of 1.25 or 1.2 or 3, it shouldn't be overheating at all. So if you're overheating, that means your CPU cooler is pretty bad, and I would not recommend overprocessor on that CPU cooler. I recommend pretty much undervolting, which pretty much you're just going to leave the core clocks and the ring clock the same. You're just going to keep lowering the voltage until you get to where it's completely stable and it's also very low. So as you can see, that's the first run. I'm going to run it for a total of 3 times. If we pass 3 times, you're pretty much stable for this run. And then we're going to go back to BIOS, increase it a little bit. And all right, so we're back in BIOS, and I just want to make something clear, guys. You do not have to raise the voltage every time you raise the speed. Raise the speed first. If you get a crash, try raising the voltage. If you still raise the voltage and it didn't pretty much work, you're pretty much at the maximum speed for the CPU. We're gonna scroll down for the purpose of this video. We're gonna do 57, and we're gonna raise up the ring ratio to around 50. I want to see if this works with no issues. We're probably gonna get a crash or a blue screen here, so for that, and let's see what happens. All right, so we're back in the OS. Open up hardware info. You guys already know the drill by now. Sensors only. Press start. Let's double check everything pretty much applied. So we're at 5.6 gigahertz. We're at 5 gigahertz on the ring, and our core temperatures look much normal as before. Let's check our VCore, same thing as before. Now Benchmate, let's run that up, and we're gonna pretty much double click R15 Extreme. Run this for a total of 3 times, and if the score is going up, that means we're getting more performance. All right, guys, so as you can see, we ended up at 680, so we gained around 10 points, which is a performance enhancement, so that means we got more. So now run this for 2 more times. Make sure you're not getting any freezes on the computer, make sure you're not blue screening, and make sure the test doesn't actually give you an error. Now I'm gonna pretty much go and show you guys how it looks like if it crashes in a second. But if you do crash at this point, try lowering the speed down a little bit, try lowering the ring ratio by 2 or by 1, and just get something stable. Goal of this test is to get this running for around 3 times. as long as you could pass 3 times on this test without any issues, you should be able to play the games with no crashes. Now, over time, sometimes if you turn off your computer and turn it on after a long night, your overclock might actually be unstable. So for the first night after doing this CPU overclock, what I would want you to do is turn off your computer for the night. Whenever you wake back up, whenever you get back on the computer, run this test for around 3 more times. If you actually error during those 2-3 times after you did a cold boot of the computer, that means something's unstable and you need to just go back, try lowering it down a little bit. And the reason for that is just quite simple. Sometimes overclocking just has weird stuff like that. So doing a cold boot and testing it next day is the easiest way to support any hiccups while playing. I'm gonna run this for 1 more time, and as long as this passes, we're gonna go straight to BIOS and increase it a little bit more. Alright guys, so I pretty much passed all 3 tests. I'm gonna restart the computer, try raising it up a little bit, and we'll see if it crashes. So extreme tweaker, all core ratio limit, I'm gonna raise this up to 58. And ring ratio usually maxes out around 50. So I'm not even gonna play around with this ring ratio. Usually you're able to do 50 or 51. Anything above that is just not going to work, and we're not going to get any benefits from that, and it's going to pretty much crash. So from this point on forward, I'm just going to only play around with the P core ratio, which is right here. And if you have the E core still turned on, you can actually overclock the E cores. However, I would pretty much leave them for last after you've done the ring and the P core ratio. Since I have the P core ratio set to 58, I'm just going to leave the voltage the same. I'm just going to save and exit, and that's the only change. I'm going to run the benchmate test for 3 more times. If it passes, straight back to BIOS, and I'm going to try raising the voltage up a little bit and increasing the CPU speed. But I have a feeling that this one might not work. So, all right, everyone, so you guys already know the drill. Hardware info, boot that up, benchmate as well. As you can see, 5.8 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz on the ring, double extreme. Let's see what happens. So as you guys can see, I actually got an error. So this means that my overclock is unstable. So this is pretty much what you're gonna get if your P core ratio or E core ratio is pretty unstable. So I'm gonna drop this down by 1, or I'm gonna try increasing the voltage. So just because I was at 1.243 voltage with this test running, I have a lot of headroom in order to increase, in order to get this stable. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna press OK. I'm gonna close out of both of these pretty much. I'm just gonna restart the computer and go straight to BIOS and increase the voltage. All right, so we're gonna go to extreme tweaker, scroll down to the bottom. CPU core voltage override, I'm just gonna increase this by 0.01 or 0.02. So I'm just gonna do 1.3, make this a little bit faster, and then just saving it. Now, if this does not work and I still get an error or I get a crash or something of that sorts with this speed, that means we're at the max overclock and we can't really any higher than 58 or 57. So we're gonna drop it down by 1 and just play at 57/50, which is gonna be a pretty decent overclock. It's pretty much not the greatest overclock, but coming from a CPU that is a 13th gen processor, which have worse overclocking capabilities compared to 14th gen, it's not too bad. And you're getting more performance for, let's just open up HW info, just like so. And let's open up benchmate again. And let's see what happens. So as you guys can see, if we scroll down, our CPU core voltage is going to be at 1.288. So that means we increased it a little bit, and now we're going to run this right here. We are at 1.26 load is what we call this. So as you can see, with this test running, we're at 1.261, which is a pretty decent voltage, and 5.8 and 5.0 is pretty much working. Let's just try to get this for total runs. We should be able to play games with no crashes and no stutters and no issues whatsoever. So let's try that out. All right, let's check it out. So 688 on the points. We did gain performance. If the points dropped 670 or 679, or it was just lower than 57, that means there's a regression in performance, and that means this is unstable. So if you do end up getting that, that means you're unstable. So just try dropping it by 1, and you'll see those points come back up. But to ideally measure the points, you want to run this for around 3 or 4 times and get just like an average of those points. If you don't get an average, then it might just be variation at the end of the day, and you might be dropping your overclock for. So far, so good. We're at 5.8 gigahertz with 5.0 ring, which is a really decent overclock on the CPU. Well, I'm gonna try running this for 3 more times and see what happens. All right, guys. So as you can see, on my 3rd run, I got an error. So that means this is unstable. So now I'm gonna try increasing the core clock just a little bit more, seeing if I can get this stable at 5.8. But I might be out of luck, so we'll see. So we're gonna go to extreme tweaker, scroll down to the bottom, and then raise the CPU core voltage by 0.02. So we're gonna do 1.32, and then just save that out. All right, boys. So we're back in. You guys already know the drill. I'm just gonna kind of speed run through this now, just to try to get this done. So we're pretty much gonna try 2, which we did earlier, but at the 3rd one we got an error, which is not ideal. So if we check the CPU core voltage, we should see that we're not anything crazy. So we're at 1.28. So after this, pretty much, I'm not going to increase the CPU core voltage at all. I'm pretty much gonna just stick to 1.28. This is the max voltage I recommend going to, especially if you have a bad CPU. Now, if you have a bad CPU cooler, just one thing to say, you need to go out and go grab another one, because you cannot overclock realistically with a bad CPU cooler. You're gonna have to undervolt and pretty much just run a lower voltage. So if you have a bad CPU cooler, you're already gonna be most likely thermal throttling at 1.26 V with this test running, or even default. It just depends on what profile you're running for CPU. So if you have only P cores enabled, then it's gonna be obviously less heat, so you're able to push the voltage a little bit higher. If you have all 24 cores enabled, so 24 E cores and the 8 cores, you're gonna have a problem. So I recommend just running 8 P cores if you're just playing games like Fortnite, Valorant, etc. If you're playing Call of Duty, just turn on the 8 P cores and leave the 16s enabled, so you have a total of 24 cores, but leave hyper-threading. As you can see, 685, which is slightly a boost. We're gonna run this for like around 2 to 3 more times, make sure we get no errors. Alright guys, so we're on the 4th run of this test. So far I have not gotten any errors whatsoever, so we're pretty much maxed out on the overclock. If I try to go any higher, we're pretty much not gonna get anything stable, so I'm not even going to attempt 5.9 gigahertz because I know for a fact this, and I'm not gonna increase the ring because these CPUs tend to max out again at 5 gigahertz, 1 gigahertz for 14th and 13th processors if you have the 8 cores configuration. Now if you have the 8 plus 16 configuration, it's going to be completely different. Core clocks and the ring clock are going to be a little bit lower, but you're obviously not going to sacrifice those E cores if you Call of Duty or any of these other games that scale with it. If that's the case, then do not worry about your speed. The whole point of this video is to pretty much just get the overclock for that current processor. Some processors will work with an overclock, some processors will actually have to undervolt or underclock out of the box. It's just how this stuff works. It's just how silicon works. It's called silicon lottery. Sometimes you get a really good overclock done with very low voltage, or sometimes you just have really high voltage for a really bad over. As you can see, we're at 5.8 and ring. We're pretty much just gonna leave it at this. I'm not even gonna increase this. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna pretty much restart my computer and save this as a profile in my BIOS, and this is gonna pretty much make sure that we're not gonna lose this profile, and we're gonna pretty much ink the BIOS after we reset itself. We're not gonna lose all of this work that we just did. So now I'm just gonna restart it again and we'll go to all right guys, so we're in the BIOS. We're gonna head over to tool. We're gonna go to Astute User Profile. As you guys can see, I already have some profiles saved, but I'm gonna name this 58/50, and I'm gonna save it at profiles. I'm gonna save it at profile 7 by going tool again. So I'm gonna save it to profile 7 just like that. Save profile, and then as you can see, profile 7 status 8/50. That's pretty much it. Our overclock's done. And again, guys, if you have a bad CPU cooler, then make sure that you go to Q fan control or your fan control in your BIOS, and make sure you set everything to pretty much for every single fan in here, because that's going to pretty much make sure that your fan speeds are not the reason. I want to make sure all that is full speed, and we're good. I'm going to exit now, save changes, and reset. And that's pretty much it. Now, I just want to say, again, as I said earlier, you want to make sure that your overclock is stable the next day. So let's just say you're playing today and you have no crackers whatsoever, and you ran that test and you have absolutely 0 errors, 0 blue screen, 0 problems, then you're good to go. But turn off your computer for the night, come back to it the next day, and run those tests one more time to around 3 to 4 times. If you pass those 3 to 4 times with no issues, you're good to go, man. You're gonna be able to play games with 0 issues, 0 problems. But other than that, that's gonna be pretty much it for this video. I know this is gonna be a little bit complicated for people on different motherboards and different motherboard vendors. I just want to say that if you do want this all done for you, along with a RAM and GPU overclock and just optimizations for Windows and all that stuff, then you can just go to the first link in the description and PC optimization service with us. We go through all of this for you, and we guide you through all of this, the phone, using Discord, and we actually just do all the optimization. If you guys want that and professionally, go to the first link in the description. We offer the best services on the internet for this sort of stuff, and we get you the actual performance without any of the hassle. Leave a comment with what overclock results you ended up with. Like this video, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.